Hello, I'm Beryl Dov Lerner. I teach philosophy at the Western Galilee College in Israel. This is my pre-recorded presentation, The Biblical Exodus Narrative as a Meditation on Temporality and Agency, which I prepared for the Narratives of Temporality conference. So this presentation will engage in biblical interpretation. So I should give those of us who do not remember their Bible lessons a little bit of background. I can start with Abraham, who is in Mesopotamia, receives a request from God that he move to the land of Canaan, where he and his descendants will enjoy many blessings, including that they will gain control of the land of Canaan and that he will become a great nation. His son, Isaac, inherits this blessing. Afterwards, Jacob inherits the blessing from Isaac, and from Jacob, it is inherited by Jacob's 12 sons, who will form the 12 tribes of Israel. One of these sons, Joseph, will end up being the viceroy of the Pharaoh in Egypt. It will help the Egyptians survive a terrible famine. Jacob's family moves to Egypt to enjoy Joseph and the Pharaoh's hospitality so that they can survive the famine years, but they end up getting stuck there, and the nascent Israelite nation eventually becomes enslaved by the Egyptian locals. So that's what you have to know. Afterwards, of course, God miraculously, with 10 plagues and so forth, helps them, frees them from Egyptian slavery, and will eventually bring them into their promised land. So the first indication of these historical events occurs way before, in a great prophecy that is experienced by Abraham. It's called the Covenant of the Pieces. It's very complicated. I won't go into it, besides just saying that one of the things that God tells him is, know well that your offspring shall be strangers in a land not theirs, and they shall be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. Now, what I argue is that this condition of being strangers in a land not theirs and being enslaved involve having the two great dimensions of human existence being disrupted. These are the dimension of space. They are in a land not theirs. They are alienated from the geography. It is not their geography. They do not control it. And they will be enslaved, which here, this is the topic of the talk, they lose control over time. So when you're in a land that's not yours and you're a slave, you have lost control of the two dimensions of existence which are required for the exercise of agency. You don't have control over the place in which you act, and you do not have control over the time within which you act. And I just bring here a quote from Frederick Douglass's classic Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass and the American Slave, to show how also in the African-American slavery, we find also this disconnect from temporality. In this quote, he talks about how he never knew his birthday. And if I read from the middle, I do not remember to ever have met a slave who could tell of his birthday. I was not allowed to make any inquiries of my master concerning it. He deemed all such inquiries on the part of a slave improper and impertinent, and evidence of a restless spirit. So here we see there's a kind of deliberate policy of disrupting temporality in the life of the African-American slaves. And now we will go into the disruption of temporality in the lives of the Israelite slaves in Egypt. So my claim is that the narrative of describing this period of slavery is written somewhat from the Israelite viewpoint, and thus speaks of the loss of temporality. We'll see that the temporal framework is stripped from the story. And also their condition is deliberately described as one in which they have no control over time. So here's my first source, my first verse. The Egyptians worked the Israelites with fire. This is an early description of the kind of work the Israelites did in Egypt. Befarach is a Hebrew word. It's translated as ruthlessly in the New Jewish Publication Society translation, New International Version, or with rigor in the New King James Version, etc. However, I think that it has a much more precise and temporally oriented interpretation that can be found when you look at a later occurrence of the term and its cognates in the book of Leviticus. Here's the law concerning, one of the laws concerning Israelite servants. If your kinsman under you continues in straits and must give himself over to you, do not subject him to the treatment of a slave. It's talking about perhaps someone owes me money and they can't pay me back. He shall remain with you as a hired or bound laborer. He shall serve with you only until the Jubilee year, which is the 50th year. I should point out that in other places, it talks about all of these slaves being freed every 7th year. There's a year of freedom. But in any case, then he and his children with him shall be free of your authority. He shall go back to his family, return to his ancestral holding. He has a return also to control of space here. For they are my servants whom I freed from the land of Egypt. They may not give themselves over into servitude. You shall not rule over him befarech. You shall fear your Lord. As for your Israelite kinsmen, no one shall rule over the other befarech. So, for some reason, the other appears twice here. In any case, befarech here is related to the idea of an unending term of enslavement without end, enslavement without any kind of temporal framework in which a person can organize their life. That I know I will be a slave up until a certain year. Here they talk about the 50th, other places on a certain 7th, returning 7-year cycle. And in that way, I will have control over at least part of my life, and I will know when that will happen. So this is definitely an issue of preserving the temporality of the servant, and a condition of servitude in which temporality is not preserved is befarech, the kind of enslavement found in Egypt. So later rabbinic writings, the Mishnah, etc., developed this idea of befarech or parech. And here I've quoted from Maimonides' code, the great code of Jewish law written already in the Middle Ages, where he gives a more conceptual definition. He says, what is parech work? It is work without set limits and work in which he, the master, has no need for, but rather he only intends to keep him, the servant, working in order that he not be idle. In other words, here we see that parech work, avodat parech, is, first of all, it does not have a temporal framework. I don't know when it will end if I'm the servant. I'm not told until when I must work. And on the other hand, it is something which the master imposes on me, not for economic benefit, but rather simply to keep me busy, to keep me from having time on my hands in which I can exercise my own agency. He wants to constantly make sure that I am doing what he tells me to do, and that I should not have a spare moment to do what I want to do. So again, avodat parech, here under the conceptualized definition given by Maimonides, is work that really has stripped the worker of the temporal dimension of his life. So he has no agency left. Here is evidence that, politically speaking, the condition of servitude in Egypt really was this kind of avodat parech. And here's the introductory paragraph, which begins the story of the servitude. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph, and he said to his people, look, the Israelite people are much too numerous for us. Let us deal shrewdly with them so that they may not increase. Otherwise, in the event of war, they may join our enemies in fighting against us and rise up from the land. So they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built the store cities for Pharaoh, Pitom, and Ramses. So this is really avodat parech. The work imposed on the Israelites, the original motivation is not economic. They are not forcing the Israelites to do this work for the economic benefit of Pharaoh and the Egyptians, but rather as a biopolitical policy strategy to keep them under control, hopefully to limit their numbers. So we generally have a case of work which not only is it, you could say, alienated from the worker, that the workers are not working for their own purposes, they're not working for any real economic purpose. They are working for the sake of being downtrodden, worked so hard that hopefully it will produce a kind of genocide. Certainly, this would not make any sense in the economic situation of slavery, where the master always has an interest in the slaves reproducing and increasing their numbers so that they can increase their capital. Here's another indication that temporality has been stripped from the narrative itself. In those many days, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned under their enslavement and cried out, and their cry for help from enslavement rose up to God. This is a very strange expression. In those many days, we are not told anything in terms of a chronological structure when it happened that they cried out, but rather the Israelites are living in a condition of many days. It's formless, has no chronological structure, one day after another. And in this ocean of endless days, they cry out. Also, the king of Egypt died. It's another interesting thing that in this story, the kings are never given names. We are not told, as we usually be told, when a king dies, how long they reigned and who replaced them and how long that person reigned, which would give us a chronological framework. But here we have a king who dies, and the narrative does not take advantage of the situation to create that chronological framework. Here's another example of the erasure of a chronological framework. In the genealogies in the Bible preceding the story of the enslavement, we consistently find a structure in which a genealogy can serve as a chronological framework. So we have, for instance, when Adam lived 130 years, he begot a son in his likeness after his image. And then he lived another 800 years, whatever. Then we read that the son Seth lived 105 years and begot Enosh. And then he lived an additional number of years and then died. When I know at what age each person in the line gave, when the son of each person in the line was born, what age each person became a father to the next person in the line, I can construct a chronological framework. Very important. I can make a timeline of the biblical narrative. But look what happens in a genealogy that occurs in the narrative of the enslavement. Here we have the genealogy of Moses and Aaron, which appears just before they come to Pharaoh. These are the names of Levi's sons by their lineage, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari, and the span of Levi's life was 137 years. The sons of Gershon, Livni, and Shimei by their families, the sons of Kohath, Amram, Yitzhak, Hebron, and Uziel. And the span of Kohath's life was 133 years. Notice we're told how long people lived, but not at what age they gave birth to the next person in the genealogy, making it impossible for us to use this genealogy, quite strangely in biblical terms, makes it impossible for us to use it as a chronological framework for the story. Again, erasure of time. What happens when time is returned? So here we have the message which God gives to Moses and Aaron just before the Israelites are free. They have to have the instructions to prepare the Paschal lamb, which will be sacrificed at the night when there is the plague in which the firstborn of each household in Egypt will die, and then the Israelites will be able to escape. Look how suddenly the narrator introduces a plethora of temporal terms. This month shall mark for you the beginning of the months. It shall be the first of the months of the year for you. Here we have the creation of a calendar. We have the literal invention of a new temporal framework. The Israelites are being told, you will now have a calendar. You will have a structure to time. This is the first month of it because this is the month in which your slavery will end. Very reminiscent of later revolutions, such as the French Revolution, which also felt the need to change calendar. But here it's not replacing the calendar of the old regime, but rather replacing a temporal void in which there is no structure with a new Israelite structure to time. Goes on, speak to the whole community of Israel and say that on the 10th of each month of this month, each of them shall take a lamb to a family, a lamb to a household. Notice we are getting this whole schedule of, in this new month, this new temporal framework, how should they organize their activities? The 10th of the month, they will take a lamb. Afterwards, they will watch over it until the 14th day of the month. Then they shall sacrifice it. And finally, when they sacrifice it and they're eating it, they will not leave any over it until morning. This is a process which has a definite beginning and a definite end. If any of it is left until morning, you shall burn it. Here we have the Israelites being introduced into finally a real temporal framework in which they can express their agency by participating in a ritual which is part of their liberation from slavery. So it's really quite remarkable how we have this sudden burst of temporality and scheduled activity and the creation of a calendar coming with the end of the atemporal condition of enslavement. All right, so far I was just talking about, as far as the condition of the Israelites and their experience of time, it's been more of a kind of a personal experience of time, which has been redeemed, that now they have a calendar of the year, which can tell them do X on day 10 of the first month and Y on day 14 of the first month. And they have this structure of time. What about historical time? Because historical time has also been lost. We heard how things happen in those many days, and that there is no genealogy which can give us a chronological framework for these events. So with the liberation of the Israelite slaves, we find the biblical narrative finally mentioning an historical time frame and really tying up this whole nebulous experience of time with a nice bow and a precise measurement of time. The length of time that the Israelites lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of the 430th year, to the very day, all the ranks of the Lord departed from the land of Egypt. And so here we really have the return into history, into historical time. That whole period of shapeless time, without planning, without agency. This has all been defined into a specific, precise historical period. They have returned into a temporal historical framework. And I'll just finish by saying that this became the basis for the entire Israelite historical framework, because afterwards we read in the book of Kings, in the 480th year after the Israelites left the land of Egypt, in the month of Ziv, that is the second month, the first month, the month of their leaving, the second month, all right? In the 4th year of his reign over Israel, Solomon began to build the house of the Lord. This connects the time frame of the redemption from Egypt with the royal chronologies that give the time frame of the book of Kings. And so we find that with the Exodus from Egypt, the entire Israelite historical chronology has been created. Here is my information in case somebody would like to get in touch with me about this presentation. Thank you very much.